Welcome to the Australian National University's Malaysia Update for 2020. I'm Ross Tapsell, Director of the ANU Malaysia Institute. This biennial update conference is hosted by the ANU Malaysia Institute, which is based in Canberra. Our institute was established in 2016 to develop research and collaboration on Malaysian politics and society, but it builds on a long history of Malaysian scholarship at the ANU. More information about our institute can be found at malaysiainstitute.anu.edu.au. This year we're doing things a little differently, running the update virtually and working with Malaysia Kini on the theme of alternative visions for Malaysia. Although this conference is held virtually, the ANU is built on Indigenous Australian land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and we acknowledge and pay respects to their elders past and present. Today it is my pleasure to host the political update, which involves a 30-minute keynote address from 3 speakers, followed by a 60-minute discussion and Q&A session involving you all here online with us today. Youth-led political reform movements are growing worldwide, and in Southeast Asia during the pandemic, youth or student movements are challenging the status quo and pressing for change. Malaysia is no exception, having recently lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. Today's political update is from 3 young Malaysian speakers who will talk about politics from their experiences and perspectives, and what they think needs to change and how youth might go about implementing that change. Our first speaker is Kira Yusril from Undi 18 and Parliament Digital. Over to you, Kira.
Thank you so much, Ross, for the introduction and for having me this year in the ANU Malaysian Update. Once again, my name is Kira Yusri. I am the co-founder of Undi 18 as well as the Education Director. Undi 18 started as a grassroots movement in 2016 to promote a youth-centric agenda. How we do that is that we campaign for lowering the voting age here in Malaysia from 21 to 18, and in July 2019 we actually succeeded with the help of YB Syed Saddiq Sadur Rahman. But however, since then we've expanded the work that we do to focus on youth education, civic engagement, as well as running multiple other campaigns to push for other reforms here in Malaysia. The Undi 18 bill has enfranchised many young Malaysians, specifically 7.8 million Malaysians to vote in the next elections. 3.9 million Malaysians were 21 years old and below, would have been ineligible to vote in the next election, but now are able to. And another 3.9 million of Malaysians who were not registered for elections before this would now be able to vote without registering themselves, thanks to the automatic voter registration bill that also passed together with Undi 18. So riding on the Undi 18's momentum, we scaled and expand our outreach work, and we launched 7 new campaigns ranging from issues of gerrymandering and equal votes, issues of gender representation in Parliament, environmental issues, Senate reform, as well as regional campaigns such as Undi Sabah, Undi Sarawak, as well as a policy-related campaign called Tenaga Belia to focus on energy policies here in Malaysia. Now, besides running Undi 18, this year we also organize Parliament Digital. It is the world's first youth-led initiative to organize a virtual parliamentary sitting to propose recommendations to address the economic and health crisis in Malaysia. Parliament Digital came about when a few friends came together and we discussed about how the Malaysian government used COVID-19 as an excuse to not have a parliamentary sitting. We felt that this was a bit ridiculous because it shouldn't be impossible to gather 222 representatives in a virtual call, either through Zoom or Microsoft Teams or even Google Meets, to have discussions and debates, especially when you've seen other countries such as the United Kingdom, Maldives, Sri Lanka, to move to a virtual parliamentary sitting or a hybrid parliamentary sitting. So we decided, why not we show them that it's possible? We decided to organize an event called Parliament Digital, or a digital parliament, and we opened applications after just 2 weeks of planning. Within 2 weeks of opening our applications, we received almost 7,000 applications to become a representative, nominations of their friends to become representative, as well as applications to become observers. This was very unprecedented, considering that we were just a bunch of young advocates. We did not have any machinery. We did not have many support from. We didn't receive any sort of like support from the government to push forward this campaign and this initiative. But we managed to raise up such we managed to garner such huge attention that during the live stream of the Parliament Digital event on both days, the 4th and 5th of July, we received almost 500,000 views combined. So we could clearly see that young people were craving for a platform to speak up about issues. Young people were thirsty, and we were looking for avenues to share our views, to share our woes, especially considering the pandemic, where so many young Malaysians were affected very critically by it. We had young Malaysians going to unemployment. We had students, from school children to university students, move from physical classrooms to online with no preparation and no heads up whatsoever. We see how university students were being asked to leave their campuses and come back to campuses and then leave their campuses again because the government couldn't decide on the right procedures. And then we could also see how government themselves were struggling with coming up with procedures because this is such unprecedented times. I think Parliament Digital was extremely unique because it brought forward 222 unique independent voices to the forefront. We did not have participants who were representing their political parties during the debates. We did not have participants who were representing anyone else's interests except their own. We had participants as young as 15 and 16-year-olds running surveys, interviewing teachers, interviewing their members of parliament themselves to ask about what are issues I should bring forth during this debate. This whole experience, beyond just an initiative to showcase what young people can achieve and how governments can support young people, but it also showed that it also was an educational opportunity to engage young Malaysians, to show them what democracy is all about. It really portrayed or showcased a platform or an effort for a diverse parliament because we had 30% women participation in the lineups. We could showcase even through the speakers of the house themselves, one of them who will be presenting later. We had Wei Chiet and Aiman, both a young Malay woman as well as a young Chinese man to lead the debates and the discussions over the 2 days. I personally thought it was really invigorating and really refreshing to just see the excitement of not just the participants but also from the general public as well as parliamentarians themselves. We had audiences from parliamentarians. We could see that the MPs themselves were inviting the Parliament Digital participants to come forth to share their views and to get their input, and hopefully this sort of engagement will continue after just Parliament Digital. Now, looking at political activism in Malaysia, what does it mean? Recently, YB Syed Saddiq, the MP of Muar and the previous Youth Sports Minister of Malaysia, announced that he was launching a new political party together with 13 other young Malaysians. These sponsors or co-founders of MUDA, the Malaysian United Democratic Alliance, made up of lawyers, activists, teachers, scientists, doctors, philosophers, and it looks very impressive as an initial lineup. And I think even on social media, they've garnered quite a huge attention just by launching one campaign or launching a hashtag. You could see that people were reacting to it so quickly and so positively and negatively. But what does it mean for young Malaysians actually? If we look at past examples, when we see how civil society leaders join politics, it does not necessarily mean that it is the best solution for reforms. One example is, for example, YB Maria Chin, who used to lead the amazing, movement of Bersih. I think everyone worldwide can recognize how much she has sacrificed for institutional reforms here in Malaysia. She ran as an independent in Petaling Jaya, a constituent that is known for its progressive voters and of course it's an urban area, and eventually she also joined the party PKR. And you can see that in our system, because she was a backbencher parliamentarian, it's very challenging to push forward the reforms and ideas that she initially championed as a civil society leader. And not only that, but many other civil society champions moved from their work in the NGO to the government. Even if they're not MPs, they work as political officers, press officers, researchers, advisors. And what you can see is that it left a vacuum within civil society where it was very difficult to keep the government in check. So I think as I will consider myself, a newer batch of advocates here in Malaysia, honestly, right? It makes people like me very cynical towards political parties' intentions. And I think this sentiment is shared across many other young Malaysians. And you don't even have to just look at MUDA, right? What exactly can political parties offer us when it comes to reforms, when it comes to tackling issues of unemployability, tackling issues of education? When you see many of the struggles that end up being publicized about political parties are always power struggles and internal drama. So I think young people also are not galvanized enough in Malaysia yet to participate actively in politics. We still have laws such as AUKU, which has not been abolished entirely, even though there was a promise by the Pakatan Harapan government. Young Malaysians are still fearful of speaking up. The school students still are not sure of what are their options when it comes to political participation. Beyond that, Malaysia also practices the first past the post electoral system, and MUDA, like it or not, will have to eventually align with a political coalition, whether it's one that has parties like UMNO or PAS in it, or whether it's one that already has many parties that stand on progressive values such as PKR and DAP. And up to today, they have not announced any serious political or electoral strategy. So I think this also gives puts forth a question to many young Malaysians, and it would lead many of us to still be wary and be concerned on what actually MUDA is standing for, and why, you could probably explain why there are still hesitance from young Malaysians to participate in a new political party, even though it seems very sexy and very, their biggest selling point so far is that they have the youth interest at heart. But I think the question that we need to ask them is that really enough? Is age alone enough to win elections? So that being said, this is where I end my presentation, and I'm very excited to also hear from my colleagues, Saudara Lim Wei Jiat, as well as Mahira from Undi Sabah after this.
Hi, my name is Wei Jiat. I am a lawyer with an interest in human rights and public interest law. I've also been involved in human rights-centered civil society organizations for the past 3 to 4 years. I am a co-founder of MUDA, the Malaysian United Democratic Alliance. It is no coincidence that the acronym MUDA also means youth in the Malay language. The idea of how MUDA as a political party started was really predicated from Syed Abdul Rahman, who was the former Minister of Youth and Sports and a key politician from the previous Pakatan Harapan politician. And the backdrop to the formation of MUDA is a bleak one. I mean, it originated from the collapse of the Pakatan Harapan government after a mere 22 months in power. Pakatan Harapan's entry into power is significant because it displaced Barisan Nasional, which ruled Malaysia for the past 60 years since independence. And there are many theories as to why Pakatan Harapan collapsed. One of the core reasons that we can't deny is the fact that there were clashes between top leaders of Pakatan Harapan on a personal level, stemming from decades of mistrust and unclear transition process. And I think that that allowed the opposition to exploit, and that led to the collapse. I think that, coupled with the political hopping that is going on, led to a lot of disillusionment, particularly among the youths in Malaysia. And the youths do form a core support base of Pakatan Harapan, and the fact that youths went out in droves in 2018 to vote for a democratically elected government of their choice, to only see it fall apart so easily, I mean, it really drives home and motivates us to believe that there is a need to create a political party. There is a need to create a party that prioritizes the people's welfare and the survival of a democratically elected government above personal differences stemming from decades of disputes. So that is how the idea was conceptualized. Then Syed Saddiq did try to engage as many people as possible, and he accumulated a group of technocrats, entrepreneurs, social activists, community organizers from all across Malaysia to try to get their input as to whether a youth-centric political party is viable, and more importantly, if it is necessary in the political climate today. And I think that in the initial stages, there may be heated debate as to whether MUDA should be a movement or a political party. I think in the end, we decided that you really need a political party as a vehicle for change, to have that voice being heard and to have leverage on how change can be made. And I think that you need to have skin in the game at the end of the day. And so the idea was conceptualized and it was formed. And I do think that this party, as Syed Saddiq has emphasized many times, is not about himself. It's not a political party that is personality based, but it's driven from the ground up. So we have engaged youths throughout Malaysia to get their views on what this party should stand for, what policies this party should advocate for, and how different does this political party need to be in the Malaysian political climate. I think that in general was how MUDA was formed. And why am I interested to, why did I decide to join MUDA as a political party? It was not an easy choice. I think for many people, for many politicians in Malaysia, joining a political party will have consequences on your professional, your personal and your family life. But what made that leap of faith is the fact that, when I was assembled in this meeting with these 30 plus individuals, it was really inspiring and it electrified me. I mean, it sounds cheesy, but the fact that these people are willing to risk their careers and to attempt to make a change in Malaysia. I mean, change is not inevitable, but to even make that attempt, knowing that we may fail, really inspired me and really made me decide to go all in. And I think that I did not want to regret 20 to 30 years later in life as to why I didn't join this moment in history. So that was just why I joined MUDA. And we may not succeed in the end, but if you look at the trajectory of the youth movements, not only in Malaysia but all over the world, we will damn well put on a good fight, that I can promise. Why is there a need for a youth-centric political party? I think that there are two key reasons. Number one, if you look at the problem of Malaysian politics, it really is the cancer of old politics. And when I use the term old politics, I mean the culture of warlords in political warlords in Malaysia, whereby politicians for a particular constituency get elected to become an MP for many terms without giving the youth an opportunity to rise up. The culture of buying loyalty through money, through gratification, the culture of character assassination, and ironically the culture of old politicians acting childishly in parliament, where you engage with jokes, ageist and sexist teasing instead of engaging with substantive policy debates for the betterment of Malaysia. I think that is the old political culture that we really need to get rid of, and I think that it is high time for a youth-centric political party to break into the scene to create that ripple effect. I don't think, with the greatest respect, existing political parties have the momentum to do that. The second reason is the issue of representation. And whilst representation is important, I think that MUDA as a political party wants to go beyond that. We want to disrupt how politics in Malaysia works vis-a-vis youth's participation. Because if you look at existing political parties, the unfortunate fact is that youths are often pigeonholed into youth wings. The same way women in these political parties are straitjacketed into women wings, and there appears to be a glass ceiling. I mean, these youths rarely get the chance to rise up and they are probably only fielded as candidates once they reach their mid-40s, their 50s. So I do sincerely believe that youths need to have a say. And if you look at the Malaysian Parliament, only 2 MPs are below 30, and most MPs are above 50, 60, 70 years old. I do think that we need fresh voices in Parliament, because in general, I do think youths bring a more idealistic, progressive worldview when it comes to policies, be it education, be it climate change, and be it the economy. I think that kind of fresh, reinvigorating views need to be injected in Malaysian politics, and I think that MUDA as a political party wants to bring that change. What are the challenges of MUDA as a political party? I think 2 main challenges. The first, and this is not unique to MUDA, is the first past the post system in Malaysia. And if you look at historically wise, third force political parties have not been very successful. Whenever there are 3-cornered fights, the third force often loses to the point where they lose even their deposits in the political contest. So if you look at the Socialist Party of Malaysia, for example, they had an incumbent MP in Dr. Michael Jayakumar, who was very popular with his constituents, but yet he lost his deposit in the last general election. So that is a very pressing concern that we will need to address, coupled with the fact that a general election is probably going to be held or must be held in the next 2.5, 3 years. We do not have the luxury of time. So I think MUDA cannot discount the fact that it may have to enter into some kind of political coalition with other parties, or if that does not materialize, we have to be very strategic in where we will want to field candidates in elections. I think the second key challenge of MUDA is to dispel this notion that MUDA is naive, too idealistic, or too inexperienced in policy making, or to play an important role in politics. I think the general perception among some in Malaysia is that youths are not ready yet. And I think that we do need to recruit the requisite number of technocrats and professionals and people who have really made it in their careers in their own right to join our party, to bolster the party, to ensure that there is always, rejuvenating, solid proposals economically, healthcare-wise, education-wise, when we do enter Parliament one day, and to prove that we are not only a fresh face, but we are more than that. We want to bring a new brand of politics, but also policy making. I think that is the challenges that MUDA would need to address in the near future. Thank you.
Thanks, Vijay. Hey guys, my name is Mahira. I'm a lawyer as well as the program coordinator for Sabah, and I generally got involved in activism just by caring about an issue first. Care about a lot of things, climate change, feminism, etc. But for me specifically, when I came back to Sabah after I finished my studies, was the statelessness issue. Then it branched out to parliamentary reforms and political activism, because I grew to realize that people, aka voters, need to be politically engaged and involved to change the things we wish to see. So that's me. So Undi Sabah was established just a few days after the fall of the state government then. So we decided that youth needs to make their voices heard. So a bunch of us were from Parliament Digital, like most of us. And that's how it started. So our movement aims to empower youth in Sabah to be more politically involved and to sort of bridge or fill in the information gap with regards to politics by improving political literacy. So all of the members were people from different and various political leanings and background. I think the recent Sabah election was very complex, that even locals are still trying to unpack it. I think if we observe most elections in the world, we see that there is an increase in polarization, and I do think that it is also the case in Sabah. I do believe that the outcome of the election was a result of voters being worried for their livelihood, safety, and generally just bread and butter issues. And especially in the midst of a global pandemic, you tend to care about what you're going to get right now. So it's about which political party or coalition that can ensure that voters' welfare will be taken care of. So in Sabah, the issue of statelessness or undocumented migrants have always plagued us since the 70s. So taking that into context, contrasting the two coalition that exists, on one hand, you have a camp which focuses on trying to reassert their power against the federal government, things like being able to have their own autonomy to self-govern. And voters were under the presumption that this may or may not be a prerequisite into getting more resources for the state, but principally it's about taking control of our state and also rally under the message of unity and celebrating differences. And as a party, like a major party under that coalition, kind of won the most seats, um, and this camp kind of won the overall votes in the state, but they didn't win as a coalition, so they didn't win enough seats to form the government. On the other hand, you have a camp which operates in a more tribalistic and nationalistic sentiment, claiming that unlike the other coalition, we're not going to associate ourselves with immigrants, or we're not going to help them because they're the ones, taking our resources and etc. So on top of that, the accusation towards the opposing party by attaching them with labels like pro-PTI, which locally means pro-immigrant, made it clear that it's their stance. So this coalition won the state election. So both visions do lead to the same conclusion, which is to ensure that voters will be safe and your quality of life will be better once you vote for us. But the side that won the coalition are the ones which promises that they're not going to associate themselves with immigrants and maybe do something about it. They never said what it was, but voters seem to believe them and voters seem to buy into that narrative. So these immigrant and stateless issue became a very serious issue this election. Like, it never got this bad. You get completely polarized views on it, and that's where it divides people. Because when I was small, when back then it was just a small issue and there were just like microaggressions and all of those things, but it never became this serious. But this election, we see that it became the deciding factor. So from Undi Sabah's perspective, there were so many candidates and parties contesting in the last election. So our campaign kind of focused on opening up a discussion by engaging with everyone across the political spectrum and divide to kind of let people decide or make their own informed choices, but mainly to let them, be exposed in the discussion. So I understand that everyone have their own biases, but just by the virtue of having the people they support to be there with a presence of people from other, parties or representative from other parties, or just they can be exposed to just generally diverse views. So yeah, so that's us. So whilst I do think that Muda's intention is noble, but also very powerful in trying to break, the culture of old politics and warlords in politics, the challenges in Sabah, I do believe, are very different, because I think Sabahans in general, which includes the youth, are very much concerned about the Sabahan agenda, because since forming Malaysia, it seems that they are not being treated as equals or acknowledged as equals, and this is reflected in the constitution, policies, as well as the literal development of their states. So the imbalance in power dynamics makes it very difficult for Sabah to kind of self-govern themselves, and this will impact things like immigrants in Sabah, infrastructure, internet connection, having an assemblyman from an Islamist party that Sabahans never consent to, but being shoved to them, and welfare, and all of these issues plaguing Sabah are because of the imbalance in power dynamics. They have no control over that these things are happening to them. So I guess in Sabah or Sarawak, Muda will need to compete with parties who are very loud and clear about fighting for the Sabahan agenda or Sarakin agenda. So they really need to know how to position themselves in that climate. So I think whilst the mechanism of Muda to be more policy centric, with to be more transparent and less hierarchy, I do think that the prerequisite for them to kind of earn the East Malaysians' trust, especially in Sabah and Sarawak, is whether you would fight for the Sabahan agenda, because all parties in Sabah and Sarawak are claiming that they're the ones championing it. So that's the barrier, I think, because if you want to talk about, policies that will improve the lives of Sabahans and Sarakians, like everyone promised that every other election. So why is this youth-led movement any different? So I don't think it's impossible for Muda to set foot in East Malaysia, since we do, like in Sabah, we do have a Malay nationalist party dominating our politics, yet we don't have natural Malays, and Malays are minorities here. But Muda is a multicultural party with progressive, mechanisms and reforms could definitely set their foot once they earn that trust from East Malaysians. But I do think Muda's presence nationally was already shifting the Overton window, because I do agree that in Sabah's politics, it is dominated by, more seasoned and veteran politicians. And it is evident in the recent, lineup of state cabinet administration. So the presence of Muda kind of shifted that mood in the recent election. We observed political parties claiming that they have youth, they have young people, they have young women, they have the youngest candidate, in Sabah, which is unprecedented. So political parties ride on that wave as well, which is refreshing, because it looks like they're more accepting of youth being in politics. But obviously, I don't deny that maybe they're just using us as tokens. But if political parties are also championing for the youth whilst being in touch with local sentiments, where does Muda position themselves then? So it's about trying to move past that. So I think one of the main challenge of Uni Sabah is obviously trying to reach people within rural areas, and you have to take into consideration of Sabah's geography and how everyone's far from each other, and it's very difficult to connect to one another, because in some areas they don't have proper roads for you to go to their community, and in to access some communities you need maybe boats to travel to their villages, and in most of these areas they don't have proper internet connectivity, so for you to send messages of advocacy. And I think that was one of Unli Sawa's biggest barrier, especially I think in today's context. The challenge is more difficult because of COVID. But just in general, for youth political activism in East Malaysia, you require a lot of resources for you to reach these communities. And it's a huge hindrance, especially for youth, because they're mostly, students, or they're just starting their career. But hopefully, youth and, other people in other communities could coalesce in trying to reach these communities to advocate for social change. Yeah. So this now ends the presentation from all of us, and we will now move to the live discussion and Q&A. Thank you.
Well, welcome everyone, and I hope you enjoyed the KiniTV presentation and production. We did try something new this year during COVID times. Obviously, this is the first time we've tried that, so hopefully you enjoyed the collaboration. And there was a bit of a lag there. I think that's what happens when you play a video through Zoom. There's not much we can do about that, but thanks to our speakers, Kira, Wayjet and Mahira, for going to the trouble of pre-recording their speeches, and they were really compelling. And so again, in this idea of trying something new, I guess we thought that there was a really interesting youth movement here in Malaysia worth discussing. And obviously there's been so much going on in Malaysian politics and lots to discuss. If you'd like to ask a question, you can do so in the Q&A chat group. Initially, we were going to open it up for others to give speeches and talks and so on and ask questions to the camera, but the registration just got too big. So we're now going to just keep it to questions via written format, and I'll do my best to go through them over the next hour. So congrats to you all first and foremost on Parliament Digital. I thought it was, you know, one of the most really exciting things to come out of Southeast Asian politics in the last 12 months. And it's a really great initiative to see young people using digital technology and promoting democracy in that way. So I think, yeah, that's the main reason why we thought we'd get you on these kind of initiatives rather than a professor of political science to talk through what's been happening in elite politics in Malaysia over the past while. But by all means, the questions may get to these discussions. I'll ask a few questions to kick us off, and then I'll start to read through some of the Q&A questions. And I guess the first question is just to ask, I presume you're all watching with interest the protests in Indonesia and in Thailand, the student movement, student protests that are going on there. And this has happened very recently, but I'm wondering whether you'll expect we'll see more of this in Malaysia, whether youth movements will move to protests, and whether there are comparisons that you would make here between the disgruntlement from youth in neighbouring countries, or is Malaysia a different case? Maybe Kira, over to you first.
Yeah, thanks for the first question. I honestly don't think that we will be reaching that breaking point soon. So I think what Thailand is experiencing with the student movement there, that they've reached sort of a breaking point where they really feel like they don't see any other options anymore when it comes to voicing out their opinions and their grouses towards the government. But I think in Malaysia, I genuinely think that we are not there yet. And what I mean by that is that, for me, I see protests as a form of speaking out when there are no other options available. But in Malaysia, young people still don't even have that civil option yet because they are not exposed to what are the options even, right? So an example is that when I run workshops and I speak to my students, a lot of them don't see certain things as rights that they have the right to speak up, they have the right to question. They don't see that yet. So until the majority of our Malaysian students are able to critically analyze what's happening around us, I don't think that we will reach that breaking point soon enough. This is also probably why you see many protests looking at the track record in Malaysia. Many of them happens in cities, and you don't really see much involvement from Malaysians in other states. I think in KK they did organize the Women's March to coincide with the one we hold here in Semenanjung, but even then it's only in KK, and you don't see the same thing happen in Sarawak or Johor or Perlis or Perak. So I think we have not reached that breaking point yet, in my opinion.
Yeah, Mahira, you're nodding. You're agreeing from the Sabah perspective there.
Yeah. So I agree that there's no appetite for that yet, because as far as Sabah is concerned, with our obviously current state right now, we're Malaysia's COVID red zone, so people are a bit apprehensive if we're talking right now. Even though there's a lot of things happening that in our state that we wish like we could change or been done differently, but generally massive rallies and protests of a larger scale are much stronger in Kuala Lumpur or in Selangor, and most youth or students do go to West Malaysia, to further their studies or to kickstart their careers. So compared to KL, I think protests or rallies are not like as much celebrated, or there's no appetite for it yet. But anything could happen. It depends on the mood and appetite of people at that time. Yeah.
Wedge?
Well, I'd just like to add that in the past, we are not alien to youth-led student movements. So if you look at the 1970s, we had the Baling protests where Anwar Ibrahim himself, led the protest against poverty. But what happened in 1975 was, pursuant to those student protests, the government amended the University and University Colleges Act to heavily restrict students from being involved in political parties and political movements. And as a result, our university students and youth in general have been living in a very, sanitized environment, quote unquote, for so long. And but in recent events do show that the youths, when the moment calls for it, they will mobilize. For example, in the birthday protest or
the protests against one in DB, there is a sizable youth population that join in those particular protests. But the underlying structural problems, i.e., the prevention of political parties from, penetrating into campuses, the fact that there's no student autonomy when it comes to student unions. I mean, those kind of things really inhibit the ability to think critically or to stop students from even thinking of joining this kind of civic movements in general. So that is something that we will need to address, and that is something that youth in Malaysia need to wake up to. That there is those kind of options, and there are critical issues out there that you may need to be called to enter into a protest movement at a particular point in time. But at this juncture, I don't see any defining public issue that would trigger this kind of youth-led protests. Not at least at this juncture.
Yeah, thanks. That frames things interestingly, which sort of leads into some other questions I had around some defining, junctures in Malaysian politics. Because as long as anyone that has, starts to study Malaysian politics, we're taught about ethnicity is crucial for understanding, Malaysian politics. So it's defined by ethnicity rather than demography. So I kind of wanted to ask that question of whether demography is more significant, or whether the polarizing topics around Malaysian society are entrenched in youths as well. So what can you tell us about engaging with Malay youths and Malay attitudes towards, say, the role of Islam in the state, the Bumiputra policy, rights of Malays, so on? Kira, to you first, and then to others.
I can't say definitively that we've engaged many people or even many Malays on this topic. But I think if you take a step back and look at these conversations, and in academic circles, in our activism circles, we do want to look at this topic a lot more. But Malaysian youth, we don't have that platform to have these difficult discussions, because there's always that fear that if you talk about Malay rights, if you talk about Bumiputra privileges, you are either questioning the status quo or you're not sure what you're talking about, right? People always, so if, for example, if you're not Malay and you want to talk about it, they'll just be like, okay, this is not something that you should ever talk about because you're not affected by it. But the thing is, all these special rights, all this different treatment that you receive, either from institutions or the government or even the general public in a form of social stigma, this affects every single person, right? And kids grow up in school knowing that there are double standards, there are opportunities that are just not available to them, or privileges that are free for them to take up. So, but I think political parties do latch on to these ideas and these sentiments and play heavily on them, regardless of which political party they are. I think especially looking at the major ones, even parties like DAP, all that, they try their best to be inclusive and diverse, but you still have players within the parties that when you go campaign, you see them using and playing on these racial sentiments as well. So I would say that the discourse in Malaysia still have not progressed past that. And because of that, and these discussions and discourse only stay within academic circles and intellectual discourse like this, political parties will still use that as a weapon when it comes, especially nearing to elections, because they know that this is an extremely hot button issue and they will not hesitate to press on it. I think I'll be interested to see if MUDA is going to tackle these kind of issues, because I think every political party and politicians knows how dangerous it is to actually bring this up and one way or the other using it as a form of a weapon in their political strategies.
All right, Wayjet, is MUDA inclusive of those range of perspectives?
I think when MUDA was conceptualized, I think we aim to be as inclusive as possible. So, and we also set forth very clearly that we will adhere to the Rukun Negara and the Constitution. So that means that nobody's going to dispute the role of Islam as a religion of the Federation. No one's going to dispute that there are certain affirmative action policies entrenched in the law for Bumiputra communities for specific areas. So we are quite clear on that. But having said that, I do think when it comes to the issue of ethnicity, it really depends on where the voters are from. So if you look at more rural areas, perhaps the issue of ethnicity, race and religion plays more heavily, but as you move towards the semi-urban and urban areas, it plays a lesser role. So I do believe that there is a growing electorate that is proud of their identity as a Malay Muslim or a Chinese Buddhist, for example, but they also recognize that when it comes to electing the representatives, there are a host of many other issues that they do consider. And race and ethnicity is not the be-all and end-all. And I think that it is our duty as a political party and politicians to not pander to insecurities and to the worst fears of people and the mistrust between the races. I think that is what Syed Saddiq has made it quite clear in conceptualizing Muda. And I think as a person coming from a minority ethnicity, that also is personally very important to me. I mean, for the past 3 to 4 years, the kind of toxic brand of racial politics in Malaysia is really disconcerting. And I do genuinely believe that the youths are perhaps less inclined to buy into those kind of race baiting in general. So it is our duty to first show that, whilst identity is important, there are issues like the economy, job creation, climate change, quality of education, youth-specific issues affecting you, which should matter us as well. And number two, we should also point out that the other political parties out there that are politicizing race and religion don't actually generally believe in pushing for your race and religion to be protected, but they are merely using it as a tool to gain political power. And I think that we also have to point that out at the same time. So that is perhaps how Muda would like to approach the subject.
Right. Mahira, you just lived through an election campaign, and in your presentation you talked about the identity politics that was central to that campaign and polarizing. Did you get a sense that there was different attitudes amongst youth on these issues?
With respect to role of Islam or Bumi Putra policy, like it wasn't. I don't think it was like heavily discussed during the recent Sabah politics. Yeah, but I do agree with what has been said by both of them. I think they explained it well. It's still a very sensitive topic, and people are still apprehensive about it. But at the same time, I do think that youths, are less likely to kind of like buy into these narratives of like fear mongering and and that is reflective in the Sabah election. I'm not sure as what will happen in West Malaysia though, but like as for Bumi Putra policy and rights of Malays, I don't think it.
And migrant workers, what in your presentation you talked about that? Was there did you think a demographic divide there in that as an electoral issue?
Oh yes, definitely. So in Sabah, like specifically, so that issue is the, I guess like the turning point of like how people decide or who do they vote for, and how political parties are going to deal with these issues. So I think people are rather polarized on that, and it seems that people are still buying into the narrative of like Sabah are for Sabahans. And we have to protect our land, like for us, and like these narratives are still being used. I guess like the context is just different in Sabah. Yeah.
We have a question from Professor Meredith Weiss, who's well known to us here at ANU and also in Malaysian politics. And her question's around patronage, and not just flat out patronage, but obviously that's a problem in Malaysia, splashing out on scholarship funds for young people, for example. But she wants to know about the more endemic efforts to go to the ground, which have long swayed voters in Malaysia. So what kind of civic education do you think that might convince new voters, people who between 18 and 21 perhaps, who've just going to be voting for the first time, to not be swayed by the fact that they or their families benefit from patronage or by a candidate's personal touch? Should we assume that younger voters today, or even new youth candidates, will perform differently? So I guess she's talking about the systemic nature, and whether civic education, whether youth will be any different. Wayjet, perhaps for you first, and I know this is something that you've thought about previously at Muda.
I think when the voting age was lowered from 21 to 18, I think one of the major concerns that we had is that our education system simply is not prepared to educate and teach the young out there on how to make political choices, on what kind of things that you should not consider and what are things that you should consider. And so I think that it then therefore lies upon NGOs like AEDT and political parties out there, like Muda, to really tell them that, look, at the end of the day, yes, the personal touch and the integrity and the personality of your elected representative is important, but more importantly, that the issues are going to define and affect your life 24/7, 365 days of the year. And those are the things which are going to really matter. So when it comes to job creation, education, and climate change, those are the issues that we need to instill are far more important than the personality. And how we go about that is perhaps a strategy that all political parties need to consider. I mean, we have seen how certain political parties have innovated to use videos and infographics or TikToks. We are talking about communicating with the younger generation today to try to creatively inform them that these are the issues which matter in a medium which appeals to them. So those are the kind of strategies that political parties may have to instill. It's not an easy task to tell you that the economy is more important than this charming 40-year-old uncle who is giving you goodie bags. But it's something that we need to do, and we need to move forward as a nation.
Kira.
Yeah, I think so civic education, voter education is really what we're trying to do here at UNDI 18. And I think it's a core part of education reform that needs to be discussed about. I think voter education is not just about political parties reaching out to potential voters, but also educators need to change their mindset, and they need to be prepared that when their students leave university or when their students leave high school, they are going to be voters and they're going to be deciding the country's future. So what kind of values and mindset that we want to prepare these students to have as they become voters, and not and to move and to to understand that it's not just about voting for people who's helping my family, who's helping my parents and things like that. But of course, different contexts have different areas and different contexts. So for example, in Borneo, they practice a lot more politics of development, where the politicians need to be the one, be there at funerals, they need to be there at weddings, or else they won't get voted in. But I think more importantly, educators need to emphasize to students that the specific roles that different representatives have. For example, I still get students who don't know that city councillors are not elected; they are appointed. When there's an issue of drainage issue, they will call their MPs and not a city council. So if we still can't understand if you still don't know what are the actual roles that our politicians are supposed to do, it's very difficult for young people to evaluate them based on their policy stance, ideologies, and so on and so on, that we often associate with politicians. So I think our education system needs to be reformed to accommodate the legislation change for UNDI 18. And we need to do it. We need to start doing it fast, because if a snap elections happen after the law has been gazetted, there will be so many more new voters in the system, and I think it's actually even going to be very difficult for politicians and political parties to navigate this scene. So I think it's actually a collective effort that everyone needs to work together, and not just a concern for politicians and political parties.
Okay, Mahira.
Yeah, so I agree with Kira. I think just through giving more, like what we can do right now is just like by giving more education and awareness to voters, be reminders of what's right and wrong. But I do think that is something that we can actively pursue even right now. But the thing is, I feel like some people might already know, but still like kind of choose them, or it's laced with something that made it seem like it's something morally acceptable for voters to kind of justify their conscience, especially in rural areas. So those who have higher access to information or like to internet connectivity are more likely to be informed. So I believe that marginalized communities tend to be deprived of these things for them to kind of like, for them to be able to distinguish like what is like, within the roles of these political parties or MPs. I think the younger generation are much more exposed to verified information and able to distinguish sources of news. So, I guess we're hopeful, because in the recent election, I do meet or bump into friends who's like frustrated, claiming that their parents or their families in their hometown are voting for a specific candidate because they've been charitable to them and they're advocating, them like not to be swayed by it. So in my mom's hometown, like people get aid and donation every election, but you don't see that in rather urban areas, like in my area, or in urban areas of Sabah. But in like these aid are much more prevalent in rural areas. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah, really interesting answers. I might turn now to the open questions that are coming through, and I'll try and get through. So please do continue to send them through. I expected this Wei Jet, so it's good to get this one started. But a lot of questions on the Pause Malaysia comment. Perhaps we could knock that one off early. What do you mean? Is it accepting the status quo to say that Malaysians should pause? I did note, I think the UMNO youth leader also said we should pause politicking just yesterday or today. Correct me if I'm wrong there, but so yeah, perhaps you could clarify what Muda wants or was thinking in that comment.
You're right in saying, well, in essence, there are many political parties and political actors which have essentially said the same thing, but they have not framed it as pause, but no one has made an issue out of it. So really what we intended to when we initiated the Pause Malaysia campaign is to really invite political parties out there to stop jostling for political realignments, and to prevent parties and politicians from jumping here and there, which is the root cause of the instability that we are seeing today. And we are also asking for no general election in the foreseeable future until COVID-19 is addressed. So those are things which to me are quite common and logical in the pandemic that we have now and in the political instability that we have now. Some people have interpreted to say that we mean to pause any kind of constructive criticism or any kind of attacks towards other political parties for the statements that they make, which was not the intention of Pause Malaysia. We have never said that we will not hold the government accountable. We have never said that we will not speak up against abuse of power or the wrongdoings of the government of the day. So I think that the messaging can be improved, I admit, but I think that if you look at the original statement and original intent of Muda, Pause Malaysia started from a very noble kind of noble intention, and I think that we do not. So there's certainly no intent to stop discourse and stop criticism and accountability for the government of the day.
Right, but you don't want to see an election.
We don't want to see an election only because it's going to deteriorate even further the COVID-19 pandemic that we have.
Right, which you've just lived through, Mahira, due to the Sabah election. Does that make sense to you, having seen the spike of cases in Sabah, that there should not be an election?
Well, I do believe that the election should be done. I don't think it was like the spread of the virus of COVID was due to the election per se. Because if we observe, in countries like Singapore and Korea, they've held their elections as well, and you don't see rise and spike. So there has to be like something in the mechanism as to how we actually conducted this election. So yeah, but because of how things have turned in the Sabah election, so we really do have to assess maybe like our machinery or our system. What are the I guess like mechanisms that we need to put in place in order for like our democracy could be sustained or even assisted, so people can participate in our democracy. But as we stand right now, I think a lot of people are apprehensive because we're not because of the rise in COVID. So yeah, I think people are apprehensive, but I feel like previously it could be safe. It's just that something has happened that maybe could have been prevented. Yeah.
Kira, what's your thoughts on the pause politicking argument that some youth leaders, including Muda, have said. Is this a case where they're doing their own politicking? This is why you're a bit concerned about youth political parties?
I think, so I think the Pause Malaysia campaign it came out at a very interesting time, especially on Twitter. I think it got the most reactions on Malaysian Twitter, especially because I think probably the day before there was the trending hashtag of Muhyiddin out. So I think, I guess the general public were just confused that whether this campaign by Muda is to complement or to go against that particular campaign. Because, and it, quite amusingly enough, immediately after Pause Malaysia launched, PKR Youth tried to launch their own Forward Malaysia campaign. It looks like to be in response of that. So it became like a hashtag war on Twitter for about 24 hours or so, which I'm not sure should be what encapsulates youth politics in Malaysia. I hope it's not. But I think if you look into the demands of Pause Malaysia specifically, I really can understand where they were coming from, especially in regards to the point of no elections, because even though Mahira pointed out there are countries that have succeeded in running elections rather safely, Malaysia did not do that. Right? Malaysia, our politicians were breaching SOPs, they were going around town, shaking hands, hugging, giving hampers and all that. And they were clearly, no regards given to the situation that we're in at all. Not to mention that there were many campaigns, including by Bersih, Undi Sabah themselves have launched a request to expand the boundaries of postal voting. And, especially for the Sabahan diaspora in Semenanjung, Malaysia. So I think unless the Election Commission is willing and have the political or have the will to change the way we do elections in Malaysia, having another election, especially snap elections, is simply unrealistic and in my opinion, quite selfish to demand. Purely because I think we can see how Sabah is really suffering right now. Every day, almost 1,000 cases, and majority of them are from Sabah. So I feel like, yes, we need to uphold democracy, and yes, we need to give people the right to voice out and to cast and make the decisions, but we also need to seriously consider what cost do these come with. And I think and I'm not saying that there's a particular government, there's a particular side or coalition that deserves to be in government, because in the end you need the people to vote you in. But I think we also need to be realistic and not be and not just assume that we can live life as normal, meaning that if there is a power struggle, we should call for snap elections right away, because that is the only way to determine who deserves to be a prime minister. Yeah. So I think young people, especially, I think you can see the responses to the campaign they are not by politicians. Many people could actually see the logic of why Muda is calling for Pause Malaysia, because they are the one feeling the brunt of the SOP breaching, the campaigning, and we are feeling it now even in Semenanjung, even in KL Selangor, when we are going on lockdowns after lockdowns, and we're not even sure whether we can still go and earn a living. So I think there are multiple facets to this, the impact of this campaign, and not enough people are looking at it from different lenses and just assuming that, I guess, painting on a broad brush that Sadiq is supporting Tan Sri Muhyiddin as a prime minister.
Yeah, I noticed you mentioned Twitter there and the blowback on that, and that leads to another criticism that might be had of all of you, although perhaps to Mahira less, and that is the urban secular youth network that you all mix in, and so I guess Indonesia is a really interesting case of a youth party that in the 2019 elections, was driven by Jakarta urban youth groups and people, and highly educated and with highly well-meaning ideas, but they didn't reach the 4% threshold. So the question is from Kian Wong, who's asking about whether there is a sort of this compromise from the outset, because Muda is an urban secular youth network, but you could say that perhaps about other groups that you're involved in, given that PAS and UMNO youth wings have already worked on big party infrastructure outside of urban areas. Wayjet, to you first.
Yeah, I think there is a general perception. I don't blame that Muda is a urban-centric party. But I do think that there is a concerted effort from Sadiq himself and many of us to include as many youth representatives and leaders from all across Malaysia, across all kind of sectors and industries, and that includes, people from the Orang Asli community in Kelantan to, entrepreneurs or people involved in the agriculture industry in Sabah. There is that attempt to reach out, and I do think we do not want to be a party that is only associated to be concentrated for urban seats and urban issues.
And is that possible, Wajed? I mean, like, to get into Kelantan, isn't Parson UMNO youth fully entrenched there, that Muda is going to be difficult?
Well, it's going to be difficult, but that doesn't mean that there is no attempt that is being made. Yes, there may be focus, we may place certain emphasis on certain states and certain types of constituencies, considering that a general election is going to come in the next 2 or 3 years. So, for example, we probably won't channel as much energy and resources to a particular seat which we don't think is a viable kind of option in the next 3 or 4 years when the general election is going to be called. But I do think on a very broad level, there is no discrimination. We are trying to reach out to as many people as possible. We do run engagement sessions with people from the northern region, from the southern region. So there is that concerted attempt. Whether it's successful or not, only time will tell. But yeah, in the near term, however, I do want to say that there will be certain focus and emphasis on certain seats, bearing in mind that a general election is going to come soon. That's something that we want to focus on.
Mahira, are these guys in a Bangsa bubble?
I guess when it first started, they kind of had that perception, but I don't think they are. They did try to, engage with a lot of communities. They did engage people from only Sabah as well. A lot of people from Sabah and different communities and activists as well. On the outset, it kind of looked like it, but I don't think so. It's just because they're professionals and technocrats, but they're also actually from, people from diverse background of different social class. Like, so YB Syed Saddiq, from what I know, is not, he's from a middle class family. So I don't think it's a Bangsa bubble. Yeah.
There's a question here from Arindoshi, Kira, which I think is a really good one. It's asking that we are seeing a steady rise in youth movements. How would it be possible to gain the trust of older generations of Malaysians who may seem skeptical of youths and of political parties? So I guess, what do you see as some promising common ground, policies or issues, which you might be able to convince older voters, not just fellow youths, that your agenda, vision and skill set are what the country needs?
I would guess that this is a universal issue across any young person that's trying to prove themselves, no matter what arena they're in, either politics or corporate or even in the activism world. Here in Malaysia as well, we're constantly being second guessed, we're constantly being judged for just because we're inexperienced. But I think if for young politicians who are trying to prove their worth, I would honestly say that it's quite easy, not easy, but I think if you want to look at I think, for example, if you want to compare against seasoned politicians, yes, there are many great seasoned politicians, but if you look at Malaysia, there's actually many bad seasoned politicians as well. Politicians who have been in power year after year after year, and I feel like as young politicians or as young advocates or young leaders rising up, this is an opportunity to pinpoint, to laser focus on the pain points of Malaysian politics and to prove that we are the solutions, or we are an alternative for what's currently out there. So I personally think that how young people can set themselves apart is to move away from the racial religion discourse that's being weaponized by existing political parties. Make it issues based, make it policy based. Every time a young leader, whether in politics or outside of politics, like Mahira and I, whenever we raise up concerns or issues, we need to be able to suggest good and concrete solutions to accompany what we're talking about. I think the biggest misconception that people have on young folks is that you don't know what you're talking about, or you don't have enough knowledge about these issues. But the thing is, it's information and knowledge is not that it's not very far-reached anymore, especially when you look at some of the problems that Malaysia have. Many other countries have already solved it. I think young people need to bring in that perspective of successful case studies around the world and see how we can have even kickstart the conversation on solving these issues here in Malaysia. Just to begin with is electoral reform, right? So many, like we keep mentioning, their elections can be done safely in a pandemic. So I think young people, young organizations need to provide alternatives or start speaking up and creating a larger pressure group to discuss these topics and to consistently stand by the solution that we are proposing, so that we can make sure that our messages gets across to people regardless of the generations and regardless of the age. Because I think when you distract them from what they assume us to be, whether it's Malay or Chinese or 21 or 55, and just keeping the discussion focused purely on the issues and policies, I think this is how we can win over, or at least bring people together in the same on the same space to have to have these discussions and to even talk about these issues, the issues that we want to champion for.
Yeah, okay. Wajed, how would this work at a party level? So obviously, at some point, you're going to have to be part of some coalition of older generation Malaysian-led older generation politicians, and you'd have been criticising them throughout a campaign and saying Malaysia needs to turn away, and they'll have their own youth parties. How do you then reconcile to say that, hey, we've got a common ground?
Well, joining a coalition is not a given. So, I mean, there is an off chance that we may have to go it out alone. So, but in the event that, a coalition is an option that we want to exercise, I mean, I can't speak for the party now, obviously, this is my personal view. I mean, I do think that, we can bridge a common ground by perhaps, making it a condition that, there's a certain percentage of youth candidates that should be filled if we want to enter into some kind of agreement with MUDA or something along those lines to justify the both sides on why and how we can work together and how we can complement one another. And I think that is the bridge that we will need to form with one another. So in all honesty, I've not really had the time to think about this particular issue on entering coalition at this juncture. But I do think that, yes, there is a problem of old politicians and old politics dominating Malaysia. But I do think that no matter how we move forward, there is still going to be their involvement at the end of the day, and we cannot disregard, the older politicians out there. They are part of the problems, but they are also part of the solution. They can be part of the solution if we leverage and we manage to reach some kind of positive agreement with them. So we cannot discount all politicians at this stage. That's my message.
Mahira, did you have anything to add?
I believe that most Malaysians and obviously politicians promise that they will make Malaysia better or aspire to improve the lives of Malaysians. So most policies or issues could be a promising ground if it's backed with data and evidence. If we're able to convince everyone, whether seasoned or veteran MPs or ministers, that a particular policy actually benefits most Malaysians and Malaysia in general, I don't think why it's could be impossible. We've seen Undi 18 teams as well as YB Sadiq, Syed Sadiq himself approach MPs across the political divide, whether seasoned or young, to get bipartisan support for the policy to pass. So to convince older voters as well as Malaysians in general, similarly by leading through examples, I think they've shown it, and this is our evidence. I do think that a lot of young ministers and politicians exhibited their capabilities, whether in office and in corporate sector, and I think even in the activism scene. So I do believe that that's primarily why right now politicians start to care or start to include youth within their political discourse and have more engagement programs. So yeah, we're very hopeful. I don't think we can always reach to a conclusion, common ground.
Yeah. There are a number of questions I'd like to get through, but one is inevitable also a little bit on the party hopping. Seems to be this is a big issue in Malaysian politics. Is there anyone like to tackle this question of how do we stop Malaysian politicians from party hopping? Is it a structural issue that needs to change that requires, regulation, or is it an ideological one where if political parties have more clear ideological policies, therefore you can hold them to account more when they jump? What do you think? Anyone want to jump in?
Okay, perhaps I can jump in because I think Muda did release a statement recently on what we think are the reforms that are needed to prevent this kind of party hopping from continuing to perpetuate in the near future. So our first proposal is to implement a recall election system. Basically, it means that if a particular elected representative hops to another party, then the constituents in that particular constituency have the option, if they have a certain percentage who have petitioned to do that, to demand for a by-election, and that defecting politician can recontest, but so can other parties, and the voters will have the ultimate choice on whether to choose the defecting politician or to choose another political party. So that is one option that would heavily disincentivize a particular elected representative from hopping to another party. The second proposal is really it may be specific to Malaysia, but it is to ban politicians and elected representatives from being appointed to government-linked companies. Because if you have seen how Tan Sri Muhyiddin has sought to consolidate its power, it is purely to appoint MPs into GLC chairman, GLC directorships. And I think that if we have a law to say that is a no-no, then there's not much option for a prime minister or a Menteri Besar, a chief minister, to buy loyalty of elected representatives through the award of positions in GLCs, which are very lucrative in nature. I mean, they come with perks and bonuses and cars and all sorts of benefits. The third proposal that we have, and it probably is also unique to Malaysia, is to split the role of Attorney General and the public prosecutor. The idea behind it is that we want to create an independent director of public prosecutions. It is important because in the status quo, the Prime Minister may have certain influence on how criminal prosecutions are being done, because the Attorney General is also the government's legal advisor. So we want to minimize whatever conflict of interest that exists now as much as we can, to prevent prime ministers from using that kind of influence to either buy political support, which is common in Malaysia because a lot of politicians are being charged for corruption and bribery in the courts now, and they have used that as a leverage for political realignment. So those in gist are what Buddha has been proposing so far. But of course, there are many other things, like for example, giving equal funding for all MPs so that MPs don't feel they need to be beholden to the government of the day, or they don't need to join the incumbent government to get funding for their constituents so that they are re-elected in the future. So there are many proposals and mechanisms that we implement that we would like to push for.
Thank you. Anyone else like to jump in?
Yeah, I think just to quickly add on, besides like what Muda is suggesting to fix the problem of party hopping, but another problem I think that actually Professor Wong Chin Huat pointed out also, that the reason why, for example, the Sabah party hopping, initially came to this point was actually even started when Shafi became chief minister back then, right? When Sabah realized that they were going to be an opposition state, and everyone understand that when you are an opposition and you are an elected member of the opposition, you will either not get your allocation or have your allocation reduced drastically. And this was a problem that PH also did not solve when it came into power. The improvement they had was they did give allocation, but it was much smaller than government representatives. So I think, when opposition members see that they begin their term as an MP or Adun already in such an unequal playing field, I think this incentivizes them to change their allegiances and to go back on the mandate that they were voted in from. So whoever is trying to solve the problem of party hopping in Malaysia needs to also look into this issue and make sure that if you are in government, you need to ensure that both sides of the political aisle receives, if you are elected member representation, you are entitled to the same amount of allocation to help the people.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah.
Sure.
So I think this key issue as well was as highlighted. Yeah.
Okay, there's a question from Ramat Shazi, and it's around the future of Malaysian industry. Obviously, one of the questions we get a lot at Malaysia Institute events involving Malaysian students is this brain drain issue. And Australia, in fact, benefits a lot from the brain drain. And a lot of young people come to Australia and they come to study. And please, there's the ANU. But the brain drain is a huge concern for Malaysia. In the aftermath of the pandemic and presumably, economic downturn globally and huge problems around unemployment and underemployment for youths. Does anyone have an alternative vision, which is the theme of our update, the alternative vision of the future for Malaysian industry and this issue of low value add industries versus high value add industries? And Mahira, I'm interested in what you think about employment prospects for young people in Sabah.
Yeah, so unique to Sabah, I guess we face some similar problem as well, because even locals from Sabah, youths from Sabah, they do go to West Malaysia to kickstart their career there. So I do think it's because people are not romanticizing a lot of the industries that Sabah could offer, and I think the structure is different, so in Sabah, you can venture into agriculture or things like agriculture or fisheries or arts that is not being, I guess there hasn't been ample support structure being given towards the youth in Sabah, because I do think that Sabah is a large country with a lot of natural resources, but I don't think that the government or the state government gives ample support structure or vision, or how we could kind of reinvent our economy. So I do think that there are efforts into pursuing that, and so I'm hopeful, but hopefully it's the government or the state government could do something about it. But we do face brain drain, and I'm not sure what is the step the government wants to take, but I do think there are ways that they could, if they want to. Yeah.
Thank you. To a couple of quick questions. One to Wayjet. What would you say to those who believe the current government is unsuited for the task of handling the crisis, and hence electing a new government is the solution to our current problems?
Well, I would say that ultimately there is a balance that you need to strike. So do you want this current government to continue administering, which I also personally believe have not been performing up to par? But what is the other choice? The other alternative, could be another prime minister like Anwar Ibrahim, but you will also risk the possibility of having a general election, and that is a real possibility should Tan Sri Muhyiddin advise the king to dissolve parliament. So I think that if you look at that from that perspective, you may risk a general election, which may aggravate the COVID-19 situation even further, and the economic downturn could be even worse. So I do think that we need to adopt that kind of nuanced view at the end of the day. I do believe that we need to form another government, preferably with Buddha inside. But yes, we need to wait for the appropriate time for the general election. It is by no means me conceding that this government is functioning and this government is some government that I support, but we need to look at it from a holistic point of view.
Okay, thank you. Question from Greg Lopez, a good friend of the ANU and graduate of the ANU's political science department. His question is to all panelists: do you think the Malaysian political system is inherently and systemically corrupt, or are there just some cases of corruption? Kira, to you first.
I don't think all politicians are corrupt, but I do agree that our political system allows for corruption to happen, and to a certain extent do not, it definitely allows, and maybe to a certain point even encourages, because it gives you so much space for abuse of power. Yeah.
Mahira?
That's my short answer.
Sure.
I agree. I agree as well. I don't think there's enough safeguards and policies that that can be put in place to kind of just control the powers of politicians. I don't think politicians are corrupt as well, but because there are gaps in laws and policies, so they kind of, exploit them.
And in the election itself, would you say that the campaign showed systemic levels of corruption on the ground, or it's largely isolated or in certain pockets that
Like I said, like it happens. Obviously in certain pockets, not all politicians do it, but it's happening on the ground. And like there are no policies or, safeguards that are being put in place. So hopefully there will be in the future. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Wayjet.
Well, I used to have some hope back in 2018 that corruption would be stamped and eradicated when the new Pakatan Harapan government came to power. But obviously that has changed, and there are now open calls by certain political parties that it is okay to lobby for criminal charges to be dropped, something to that effect. So it's really sad seeing how Malaysia was poised to combat corruption, in 2018 and at the level that we have now, where, leaders are going to have a comeback. So corruption is a very serious issue, and I think that MUDA does set out to, that is a huge priority for MUDA. We want to introduce laws which cap political funding, which prevent this kind of loopholes from happening and prevent corruption from further perpetuating. And I think that that is something that will play a huge role in the next general election to come.
Thanks. I might finish just on a nice softball question, but I think it's important given the success of Parliament Digital as a new model that showed to Parliament, look, this is how it can be done. And it was in July of this year. But what now? How do you sustain something like this to keep it going? Kira, to you first.
I think that's a very good question, because I think Parliament Digital really kickstarted a hype of and all eyes will get young people after the event. At least on my part, we're trying to think about how can we continue to engage the group that's been impacted by the event by running either workshops, engagement programs, but also we want to, at AEDT, we want to try to create more innovative programs like this that provide the platform for Malaysian youth to experiment and to play and to learn politics that they've never learned before, the way they never learned before, right? With outside the boundaries of the classroom and all that. I think we are also hoping to introduce them to the concept of policies and not politics first, because what we've learned in Parliament Digital that many of these participants have never been exposed to any form of political advocacy before. This is their first entry into what is debating in Parliament about, what are policies about even. So we're hoping to create or duplicate this form of similar form of innovation in future programs. I personally am not sure if Parliament Digital will happen again next year, because it was done in reaction to the parliamentary sitting. But I do hope that we can at least consider and other NGOs and government to consider how can we innovate youth programs so that it's not just like a 2-3 day camp organized by the government and then they learn about boring stuff and then they just lose interest in politics or understand or policy.
Mahira?
Yeah, so I was helping out with Parliament Digital, and most of the members in Undi Sabah were from Parliament Digital. Maybe even if like Parliament Digital wouldn't be host next year, but I do think like the impact was great enough that it mobilized a lot of youth into being more active and participative in politics. So I think that's a great step and that's a great turning point.
And finally, Wayjet, there's a question here from Diana Anwar, who's a graduate of the ANU, who's asking, where does MUDA see itself in 5 years? So perhaps you can finish on that one.
Well, it really depends on when the general election will be called. I do think that, if a general election is called in the next 2 to 3 years, we may have a very strong chance. Well, at least I believe that we have a strong chance of earning some seats in Parliament. And I do think that we have to build on that to push forth for not only youth-centric policies, but a brand new kind of politics that focuses on issues, that focuses that brings away from the personality-driven politics that we have today. And I think that is the ultimate goal of MUDA, to make sure that youths are no longer at the back seat, but they are at the driving force of Malaysian politics, and their time is today and not tomorrow. And that is the kind of message that we want to bring. And I do think that there is a lot of hope in what MUDA can achieve in the next 5 years.
Well, thank you to all our panelists, Kira Yusri, Lim Wei Jet, and Mahira Mazuki. And thank you to you all for being here today. Speaking of today and tomorrow, tomorrow is in fact the economic update, which will be at 10 a.m. Malaysian time and 1 p.m. Australian time. And we look forward to seeing you there. And on Friday will be our cultural update, 10 a.m. Malaysian time and 1 p.m. Australian time. So thanks for everyone for participating in the political update, and hope to see you again tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.